The morning after my son's rehearsal dinner, I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive. Not because I was crying. I was done crying. I sat there because I needed to decide, before I turned the key, whether I was going to do what I was thinking about doing, and I needed to be cold about it. I've always done my best thinking when I'm cold about things. By the time I pulled out onto Jefferson Avenue, I had decided. I called my attorney's office before I even got home. You need to understand something about me before I tell you the rest of this. I am 63 years old. I have worked since I was 15. I raised my son alone starting when he was 4, after my husband left and took most of what we had with him. I cleaned houses, then I cleaned office buildings, then I started my own cleaning company. Then I bought the building my office was in. Then I bought the strip mall across the street when the owner fell behind on his taxes. Then I bought a warehouse and converted it into 12 rental units that are currently all occupied. I did this quietly over 30 years, while my son went to school and then college and then law school. While I told him his tuition was covered by a small inheritance from my mother that didn't actually exist. I told him that because I didn't want him to feel obligated. I didn't want him looking over his shoulder at what I built, feeling like he owed me participation in it. I wanted him to build his own life on his own terms and be proud of it. That may have been a mistake. I see that now. But I made it with love, and I'd ask anyone judging me to sit with that for a moment before they open their mouth. My son's name is Beckett. He's 34. He's smart and kind, and until about 18 months ago, when he started dating the woman he was about to marry, he called me every Sunday without fail. Her name is Ingrid. Her mother's name is Sylvia Holt. I want you to remember that name. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant called Sable. It's the kind of place with no prices on the menu and a sommelier who materializes at your elbow without being called. Sylvia Holt's choice? Naturally. She'd organized the whole evening, which I only found out when my invitation arrived, with a note saying the dress code was elegant evening. I wore my navy dress. I've worn it to 3 funerals and 1 gallery opening, and it has never failed me. I arrived a few minutes early. The hostess led me to the private dining room in the back, and when I walked in, Sylvia was already there with her husband, Randolph, and their daughter Ingrid, and a collection of people I didn't know arranged around a long table set with ivory candles and white orchids. A woman I later learned was Sylvia's sister was showing photos on her phone to a man in a blazer that cost more than my first car. Sylvia looked up when I came in. She had that particular kind of smile that arrives on the face before the eyes have agreed to it. "You must be Beckett's mom," she said. She said it the way you would say, "You must be the caterer." "I am," I said. "Lorraine?" "Lorraine." She repeated it like she was filing it somewhere unimportant. "So lovely. We've heard so much." I doubted that. Beckett came in about 10 minutes later, and when he saw me, he crossed the room and hugged me, which helped. He looked happy. He looked the way I'd spent 30 years trying to make him look. I held on to that. The dinner was pleasant enough on the surface. The food was extraordinary. I ordered the salmon because I recognized it, and I ate it quietly while Sylvia held court at her end of the table, telling a story about a summer house in Maine and the difficulties of finding good landscapers. Randolph, her husband, laughed at everything she said. Ingrid looked at Beckett the way you hope someone will look at your child. That part was real, I think. I believe she loves him. I just don't believe the apple fell far enough from the tree. After the main course, before dessert, Beckett stood up to say a few words. He talked about Ingrid, and his voice got a little unsteady in the middle, and I pressed my hands flat on my thighs under the table because I was so proud of him I could have embarrassed both of us. Then he said he wanted to thank me. He talked about what it was like growing up with me. He mentioned specific things. The way I used to pack his lunch with a note folded inside. The year I worked Christmas Eve and Christmas morning, both so he could have a real Christmas afternoon. And I kept my face very still because the alternative was not acceptable in that company. Then he said he had asked me to bring something tonight. I reached under my chair and brought out a small box. Inside was a binder. Old, brown leather, a small crack running along the bottom corner. Inside the binder were recipe cards. some handwritten and some typed on an old typewriter, going back 60 years. My mother's handwriting, her mother's before that, my own additions in the margins, the meatloaf we made every Sunday, the pie crust that took me 11 tries to get right, the Christmas cookie recipe that was the last thing my mother and I baked together before she got sick. I had added a section in the front, new pages where I'd written down what I remembered of the stories behind the recipes. Who taught whom? What occasion? What year? I had made it for Ingrid. That was the truth of it. I wanted her to have something that came from us, from the women before me, so that when she and Beckett built their life together, there would be a thread going backward, holding them. I set it on the table in front of her. Ingrid said, "Oh, how sweet." She opened it, glanced at the first page, then set it to the side. Sylvia leaned forward. She looked at the binder for a moment. Then she looked at me, and she smiled. "A handwritten recipe book," she said. "How charming." She turned to the woman beside her. Her sister and I watched something pass between them. A flicker. "Very homespun." The sister laughed softly. "Sylvia," Randolph said, not really meaning it. Beckett had sat down. He was looking at his water glass. Sylvia continued, "I'm sure it's a very nice little scrapbook." Her voice had that particular warmth that isn't warmth at all. Very appropriate, sentimental. She reached forward and slid the binder an inch further toward Ingrid, as if she was helping set the table, tidying up, moving something out of the way, and Beckett said nothing. I waited. The table was quiet for a moment. I counted to 3 in my head the way I used to when he was small and I needed him to do something. He picked up his fork. I set my napkin on the table. I reached forward, picked up the binder, and placed it back in the box. I set the box in my purse. I pushed my chair back, and I stood up. "Thank you for dinner," I said. I said it to the table, not to Sylvia specifically, because I have my own manners. Beckett said, "Mom, enjoy your dessert," I said. "The salmon was wonderful." I walked out. My attorney's name is Hector Vane. I've worked with him for 19 years. He was the one who structured my first real estate purchase, and he's managed everything since then. He's seen me at my most exhausted and my most certain, and he knows the difference between the two. When I came into his office that Thursday morning, he stood up the way he always does and offered me coffee, which I declined, and then I sat down and I told him what I wanted. He was quiet for a moment. "Lorraine," he said. "I know," I said. "I want to make sure you understand the scope of what you're describing." "Hector, I built the scope," I said. "I understand it." He looked at me for a moment, then he took out a legal pad. "All right. Walk me through what you want to change." The estate, as it was currently structured, designated Beckett as the primary beneficiary of the majority of what I built: the properties, the rental portfolio, the company itself, and the accounts associated with all of it. The total value at last assessment was approximately $4.2 million. That's not the number that makes the news, but it is the number that took me 30 years of 7-day weeks and second-guessing myself in parking garages to accumulate, and I was the one who decided what happened to it. I didn't cut Beckett out entirely. I want to be clear about that. I left him a portion, a meaningful one. I'm not a cruel woman, and he's still my son, and whatever has happened, I know who raised him and I know what I put into him. But I made changes. I redirected the larger portion to 2 places. The first was a foundation I'd been quietly funding for 3 years that provides transitional housing to women leaving shelters. The second was a vocational training program at a community college 40 minutes north of the city, one I'd attended myself decades ago when I was trying to learn bookkeeping so I could manage my own accounts without paying someone else. Hector drafted the changes. I reviewed them. I signed them. I drove home and I made myself a cup of tea and I sat at my kitchen table with the binder in front of me and I opened it to the first page. My mother's handwriting. She'd learned to write in a schoolhouse in rural Ohio and she pressed too hard on the pen and the letters were big and slightly uneven and absolutely her. Her pot roast recipe, dated 1971, with a note in the margin that said, "Add more salt than you think." Trust me, I did not cry. But I sat there for a long time. I didn't hear from Beckett for 6 days. When he called, I was in the middle of reviewing a lease renewal for one of my commercial tenants. I let it ring twice. Then I answered, "Mom." His voice was careful, prepared. "Beckett, I've been thinking about what happened at the dinner." "All right." "I should have said something." A pause. "I didn't, and I should have, and I'm sorry." I let that sit for a moment. "What stopped you?" Another pause. Longer. "I don't know." "I think you do," I said. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, "She doesn't always. Ingrid's mother is complicated." "Most people are complicated," I said. "That's not what I asked." He exhaled. "I didn't want to make a scene." "She mocked a gift I spent 6 months putting together," I said, keeping my voice even. "She mocked your grandmother's handwriting. She mocked 40 years of women feeding their families, and you picked up your fork." I paused. "That's not avoiding a scene, Beckett. That's a choice. And choices tell people who you are." He didn't fight me on it. That was something. We talked for almost an hour. I told him some things I probably should have told him years ago, about what I built, about why I'd kept it quiet, about the fact that the inheritance from my mother had not in fact existed. He was quiet through most of it. At one point, he said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" And I said, "Because I wanted you to make your choices free of it. I'm not sure that was right." He said, "I need to think." "That's fair," I said. "Think." He called me again 4 days after that. He didn't mention the estate. He didn't ask about the money. He said Ingrid had tried to tell him that I had overreacted and that he had told her that he didn't think that was true. He said they had talked about it and it had not been an easy conversation, and he didn't know yet what things would look like on the other side of it. He said, "But I want you to know I'm not picking up my fork this time." I said, "Good." He said, "I love her, Mom." "I know you do," I said. "That's not the question." The question, I didn't say aloud, was whether he would go through the rest of his life letting the people around him treat the people he loved as though they were furniture. That question was going to answer itself, one way or another. I've learned, at 63, that you can't answer questions for other people. You can only make sure they understand that the question is being asked. The wedding went forward, 3 weeks later. I attended. I wore a different dress, the emerald green one that I bought myself the year I paid off my second mortgage, and I arrived on time and sat in the 3rd row and watched my son get married with my hands folded in my lap. Sylvia Holt sat across the aisle. At one point, before the ceremony began, she made her way toward me, and I watched her clock my dress, which cost more than I'd care to admit, and the strand of pearls I'd received from my grandmother, which were real and which she had no way of knowing were real. And I watched something shift in her expression. Just slightly. She said hello. I said hello. She said, "We should do lunch sometime. Get to know each other properly." "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it the way I meant most things. I said to Sylvia Holt, which was not at all. The ceremony was beautiful. Ingrid cried. Beckett cried. I did not, but I held a tissue in my hand because I am not made of stone. At the reception, Beckett came and found me during the cocktail hour. He didn't say anything. He just put his arm around me and stood there for a moment, and I leaned into him very slightly, and that was enough. "I told her," he said quietly, "Ingrid, about everything." "I know," I said. He'd mentioned it. She was surprised. "I imagine so." He looked out at the room. "She asked if you were angry at her. I told her I thought you were more disappointed than angry." "That's about right," I said. He nodded. We stood there a while longer. The band started playing something I recognized from about 1987, and 2 of Ingrid's younger cousins immediately pulled each other onto the dance floor. "The cookbook," Beckett said finally. "What about it? Would you still consider giving it to her?" I thought about that for a moment. My mother's handwriting. Add more salt than you think. "Trust me. Ask me again in a year," I said. "If she's earned it?" He nodded. He didn't push. That was growth. I recognized it. Hector called me on a Tuesday about 2 months later. He'd heard through channels that Sylvia Holt had been making inquiries, discreet ones, the kind that aren't very discreet at all when you've been in a small legal and financial community long enough. She'd apparently mentioned at a charity luncheon that someone at Hector's firm attended that her son-in-law's mother was in property management, said the way you'd say someone was in between things. One of the women at that luncheon had leaned over and said, "Oh, you mean Lorraine? She owns the Callaway Group." And she named 3 buildings in our city that the Holt family almost certainly drove past regularly without knowing who held the deed. I was told that Sylvia had not said much after that. I can't say I felt nothing when I heard this. I'm a human being, but what I felt wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a thing being correct, of a ledger balancing. I went home. I made dinner, the pot roast, my mother's recipe, adding more salt than seemed right, trusting her. I ate at my kitchen table with a book open beside my plate, the way I've eaten most of my meals for the past 30 years. The binder was on the shelf in my kitchen, where it has always lived. I looked at it for a moment before I sat down. I thought about my mother pressing hard on the pen in that schoolhouse in Ohio. I thought about her mother before her and the woman before that, feeding people in kitchens I'd never seen, in times I'd only heard about secondhand. All that knowledge, all that care, passed from hand to hand like something too important to put down. Sylvia Holt called it a little scrapbook. What it actually was, I thought, was a record of women who built things. I know something about that. I sat down and I ate my dinner, and it was very good.